Welcome to Bread of the Word, a space for quiet minds and anchored hearts to dwell on the glory of Christ. Let's ponder the verities of God together and meditate on the mysteries we do not yet understand, looking back to our Redeemer, that we might walk forward in His grace. Hello, welcome back to the Bread of the Word podcast. This is a gentle space for quiet Protestant theology, rooted in Scripture and grounded in the glory of Christ. My name's Tyler. I'm your resident Lo-Fi Theologian, and we are continuing our trek through the book of Job, verse by verse, chapter by chapter, chunk by chunk. And today we are dealing with chapter 33, verses 1 through 12. These are the words of God. Wherefore, Job, I pray thee, hear my speeches, and hearken to all my words. Behold, now I have opened my mouth, and my tongue hath spoken in my mouth. My words shall be of the uprightness of my heart, and my lips utter knowledge clearly. The Spirit of God hath made me, and the breath of the Almighty hath given me life. If thou canst answer me, set thy words in order before me. Stand up. Behold, I am according to thy wish in God's stead. I also am formed out of the clay. Behold, my terror shall not make thee afraid, neither shall my hand be heavy upon thee. Surely thou hast spoken in my hearing, and I have heard the voice of thy words, saying, I am clean without transgression. I am innocent, neither is there iniquity in me. Behold, he findeth occasions against me. He counteth me for his enemy. He putteth my feet in the stocks. He marketh all my paths. Behold, in this thou art not just. I will answer thee that God is greater than man. Now, as we saw in the last installment, we are working through the words of Elihu. And Elihu is an interesting character that commentators and just people in general throughout church history have not entirely known what to do with. That you'll come across a handful of different ways of grappling through his words and kind of his contribution to the book of Job. And personally, what I think makes the most sense is one of two things. Is either this is an appearance of Christ in the Old Testament, something similar to Melchizedek, or when Jacob wrestles with God in the wilderness, or something like that. Or Elihu is in some way being prophetic. But whatever we do, we have the words of Elihu that are given to us to prepare the way for the Father to speak from the whirlwind. That is what we have. That is what we're looking at. Personally, I'm persuaded to the former, but that is not something that I'm going to impose on the whole of Christianity. This is something that Christians have really struggled with and will continue to struggle with, is what do we do with Elihu? And Elihu, in these words that we have before us, we have a couple of recurring phrases. That recurring words that I want us to kind of hone in on are behold and words. These are two very important words that pop up again and again and again in this text that we're going to need to lock a hold of. Because there are, how many times does he say, behold this, behold that? But also he gives emphasis to the sourcing of his words. And that's important because of what we established last time with the presupposition of Elihu coming into the speech, is that Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, that they have postulated, they have postured, they have given a lot of bad wisdom in the name of God. And on top of that, they haven't really answered Job's questions. And Job has been able to say some equally unwise things about God. And it says in chapter 32 that the wrath of Elihu was kindled. Why? Because Job justified himself rather than God. That over the time that we've dealt with Job, we've seen his focus go from God does things I don't understand to something more inward, clinging to his innocence. And Elihu looks at that and says that's wrong. And that is the baseline behind everything we're going to see in these next several chapters. But he says, "Behold, now I have opened my mouth, and my tongue hath spoken in my mouth. My words shall be of the uprightness of my heart, and my lips shall utter knowledge clearly." That is the difference between Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, and what Elihu seeks to contribute here now, is that his words shall be of the uprightness of his heart, that his lips shall utter knowledge clearly. And just as we've seen in Proverbs and even in First Peter about being slow to speak and quick to listen, so we've seen that modeled by Elihu, that there is a time to speak and there's time to not. But now he is speaking, but it's not out of anger, it's not out of malice, it's not out of pride, it is out of truth. "And my words," he says, "shall be rooted in an upright heart." Which is very significant, because this is how we're introduced to Job in the beginning of the book, is that he is upright, he is blameless and upright, one who fears God and escheweth evil. And likewise, we have Elihu building on that language, that he is in some sense upright, that he is speaking from a heart that is upright, one that is blameless. And furthermore, in verse 4, he says that the Spirit of God hath made me, and the breath of the Almighty hath given me life. That is straight Genesis language right there. And while I believe Job came first, Genesis uses this exact phrase, the Spirit of God, the Ruach El, which is basically the Old Testament way of saying the Holy Spirit. This is what we read. If we were to read this in Hebrew, this is what we would find in Genesis 1, when it says that the Spirit of God hovered above the face of the deep. And so the Spirit of God, he says, has made me, and the breath of the Almighty has given me life. And what do we do with that? Verse 6, "Behold, I am according to thy wish in God's stead. I also am formed out of the clay." And here's why I think that this is an appearance of Christ, is that this is teeing up the mediator role of Christ that we see in the New Testament, that this is a picture that serves as a promise. Because Job has lamented throughout this book about the lack of a mediator. Job 9:33 says, back in the verse 32, "For he is not a man, as I am," speaking of God, "that I should answer him, and we should come together in judgment. Neither is there any daysman betwixt us that might lay his hand upon us both." And that Hebrew word is hard to translate, but it essentially means umpire, or something very, very old culturally. But he's lamenting the lack of a middleman between himself and God to make his case. We might say umpire, we might say middleman, mediator is another word that can work there. But that is a recurring issue that Job expresses throughout those early chapters, is that there's no mediator, that as he suffers, as he's unaware in that suffering, God is seemingly silent. And there's none to plead his case before God, before the Father. And Elihu seems to say that he is that. "Behold, I am according to thy wish in God's stead. I also am formed out of the clay." That Elihu has presented himself as a mediator between Job and the Lord. How do we work with that? I think this is one way of looking at it, is that this is either an appearance of Christ in the Old Testament, or this is something unique that serves as a way of promising what we know Christ to be doing in the New Testament. What we know from the book of Hebrews, when it says that he ever liveth to make intercession for us. And so he says, all but outright says, that he is what Job has been asking for, is a daysman to stand betwixt them, that I am according to thy wish, that I am formed out of the clay for this purpose, he says. "Behold, my terror shall not make thee afraid, neither shall my hand be heavy upon thee. And these are words and phrases that Job has been saying throughout the book, that the hand of the Lord is heavy upon me, or that his terror, the terror of the Lord shall make me afraid. These are phrases that Job has uttered throughout the book, and we've looked at all this before. If you've been tracking with the series for a while, I've been in Job for like 3 years, so it's definitely been a journey. But he assures Job that that is not how his dealings with Elihu will be. That the interactions between Elihu and Job is not one of terror and condemnation, but something else. That Elihu seeks to provide something that has not been seen by the other three people to speak. Verse 8, surely thou hast spoken in mine hearing. You have spoken in my presence, and I have heard of the voice of thy words, saying, I am clean without transgression. I am innocent, neither is there iniquity in me. Behold, he findeth occasions against me. He counteth me for his enemy. He putteth my feet in stocks. He marketh all my paths. These are all quotes from Job, direct, verbatim. The things that Job has said. These are examples of what Elihu says. He justified himself rather than God. That you have clung to your innocence. You've clung to your innocence, and that God has just dealt you a bad hand, so to speak. That he has found occasions to do this to me, to count me as his enemy. And Elihu says, in this, thou art not just. You are not right in this assessment. Why? He says, because God is greater than man. That is the breaking point here in the narrative. Is Elihu brings something different onto the table, into the narrative than anything else we've seen. So much so that there is a fracturing of the narrative when he enters the scene. And his dialogue, his monologue, his speech that we will be working through for the next several chapters, this is different. He has a different angle, he has different convictions, and he has different wisdom to bring to Job. And at the end of this opening section, we have the statement that God is greater than man. We have an encouragement to behold. That just as he's opened this paragraph, he keeps repeating this word, behold. What are we to see? What are we supposed to see? And he says that God is greater than man. That in the face of Job's suffering, he should recognize that God is greater than man, that they are not on equal footing. Elihu says that is the main takeaway, is the difference between God and Job. And Job, he says, has lost sight of that. As he has lamented, as he has suffered, as he has all but accused God, Job has seemingly lost sight of who God is in the midst of his suffering, which is understandable and also relatable. That is a ditch we all run the risk of falling into, is we forget who God is, and that he is not like us. That's actually something that Jeremiah laments, is that they thought God was like them. And so the opening point of contention is behold God as he is. not as we would like him to be, not as we wish him to be, not as he was 10 days ago, but behold God in full. The fullness of who he is, what he does, and what he will continue to be is on display here. That whatever we do in the midst of suffering, in the midst of triumph, behold God as he is. Okay, if we go to Exodus. We look at Exodus chapter 3. This is after Moses has fled from Egypt after the murder of an Egyptian. He has been in the wilderness for an extended period of time. And the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of the midst of a bush. And he looked, and behold, the bush burned with fire, and the bush was not consumed. And Moses said, I will now turn aside and see this great sight, why the bush is not burnt. And when the Lord saw that he turned aside to see, God called unto him out of the midst of the bush, and said, Moses, Moses. And he said, Here am I. And he said, Draw not nigh hither. Put off thy shoes from off thy feet, for the place whereon thou standest is holy ground. Moreover, he said, I am the God of thy father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look upon God. So before he even says who he is, God says, this is holy ground. That where you stand is consecrated ground, is consecrated by my presence. And from that introduction, then he says, I am Yahweh. I am the God of covenant. I am the God of thy father. I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Moses, it says, hid his face. And further down the text, he asks, what is the name? What is the name of this God? And God says, I am that I am. Thus shalt thou say unto the children of Israel, I am, hath sent me unto you. And we know that Hebrew word to be roughly translatable as Yahweh, but it means I am that I am. And this is different from the other names of God that we find in paganism. With the names of the pagan gods, there's a different wordplay. Oftentimes it has a differing presupposition. God's names don't tell you what he does, they tell you who he is. As opposed to having some symbolic esoteric meaning with pagan gods such as in Greek mythology or Nordic mythology, where the name is more symbolic. Like Hel, the Norse god of the dead. But then with Exodus, with the introduction of God's covenant name, it's literally just I am. I am the God who is. The God who simply is and does not owe you an explanation. Why? Because God is greater than man. That is what Moses is confronted with. That is what Job is being confronted with. Is the threshold between the sacred and the secular. The threshold between God and man, that we are not the same. God is infinitely higher. He is infinitely greater. As the Westminster Confession says, he is the highest and most perfect good. And yet, this God has made himself known to us. And that cannot go without saying, as we've read Job, that as we've looked at Job, God has made himself not only concerned with the affairs of the earth, but he's made himself known to Job. If we go back to his conversation with the devil, we see this illuminated a little bit in chapter 1. And the Lord said unto Satan, Whence comest thou? And then Satan answered the Lord and said, From going to and fro in the earth, from walking up and down in it. And the Lord said unto Satan, Hast thou considered my servant Job, that there is none like him in the earth, a perfect and an upright man, one that feareth God and escheweth evil? The God who dwells in inescapable light, the God who is above the heavens and the earth and everything under the earth, refers to Job as my servant. He expresses ownership and affiliation with Job. He's made himself known to us, and he's very concerned with what goes on in the earth, that he is not removed from what happens down here. Even though there is this idea of threshold, here he is aware and involved. And even to take a step further, we have the Gospel of John that opens the way that it does. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The same was in the beginning with God. All things were made by him, and without him was not anything made that was made. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. And the light shineth in darkness, and the darkness comprehended it not. There was a man sent from God, whose name was John. The same came for a witness, to bear witness of the light, that all men through him might believe. He was not that light, but was sent to bear witness of that light. That was the true light, which lighteth every man that cometh into the world. He was in the world, and the world was made by him, and the world knew him not. He came to his own, and his own received him not. But as many as received him, to them gave he power to become the sons of God, even to them that believe on his name, which were born not of blood, nor of the will of the flesh, nor the will of man, but of God. And the Word was made flesh, and dwelt among us. And we beheld his glory, the glory as of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. John bare witness of him, and cried, saying, This was he of whom I spake. He that cometh after me is preferred before me, for he was before me. And of his fullness have all we received, and grace for grace. For the law was given by Moses, but grace and truth came by Jesus Christ. No man hath seen God at any time. The only begotten Son, which is in the bosom of the Father, he hath declared him. That God came into our world. He dwelt among us. That this same God who dwells in the heavens came in the form of a man and dwelt among us. He lived in our mess with us. It says in 2 Corinthians 7 that he became sin, who knew not sin, that we would become something we're not, that we would become the righteousness of God. And so Christ puts on flesh, dwells among us in the midst of our mess, in the midst of our sins, lives a perfect life that you and I could never live, and dies in the sinner's place intentionally. He rises from the dead. He ascends back into heaven, seated at the right hand of the Father. And what does he now do? He is our mediator. That which Job longed for, that which Elihu alludes to, we have finished and ongoing through Christ. Hebrews 7:25. Wherefore he is able to save them to the uttermost that come unto God by him, seeing he ever liveth to make intercession for them. For such a high priest became us, who is holy, harmless, undefiled, separate from sinners, and made higher than the heavens, who needeth not daily, as those high priests, to offer up sacrifice, first for his own sins, and then for the people's. For this he did once, when he offered up himself. For the law maketh men high priests, which have infirmity. But the word of the oath, which was since the law, maketh the Son, who is consecrated forevermore. Now of the things which we have spoken, this is the sum. We have such a high priest, who is set on the right hand of the throne of the majesty in the heavens, a minister of the sanctuary and of the true tabernacle, which the Lord pitched, and not man. For every high priest is ordained to offer gifts and sacrifices, wherefore it is of necessity that this man have somewhat also to offer. For if he were on earth, he would not be a priest, seeing that there are priests that offer gifts according to the law, who serve under the example and shadow of heavenly things, as Moses was admonished of God when he was about to make the tabernacle. Verse 6, but now hath he obtained a more excellent ministry, by how much also he is the mediator of a better covenant, which was established upon promises. This is Christ. This is what he does. That what Elihu points us to is a fuller sense of that mediator work, of pleading our case before the Father as God in flesh, as God incarnate. That is what Christ is doing today. That is what he was doing yesterday. That's what he's doing tomorrow. Is he is pleading on our behalf. I believe it was Martin Luther who said, if I could hear Christ praying for me in the other room, that I would not fear 10,000 armies. But he is praying for me. This is the reality that we have, is that Christ is interceding on your behalf today. That Christ has secured our salvation. And he forever will stand in the gap between us and the Father. That threshold has been crossed by the Son. Although God is greater than man, there is only one God who became man, that we would have access to him, and that is Christ. So as we read these words in Job, this is ultimately what we have to keep at the forefront of our minds, is that God is our priest, that Christ is our priest, who has gone behind the curtain on our behalf. And the types and shadows we see of priests in the Old Testament ultimately leads us to Christ, who has done all the work necessary once and for all. So this week, ponder that. Ponder that God is greater than man, and yet he has granted us access to him through Christ, through a perfect sacrifice and a sinner's cross. Reflect on that. Ponder that. Let this burrow deeply into your heart. And let this drive you to worship. Pray the Psalms, not as one who is seeking to earn God's favor, but one who has already received all things through Christ, who gives freely to all that ask. Sing the Psalms, pray the Psalms, meditate on the verities of God as one who has been given all things through Christ, who has been clothed in his perfect righteousness and has now been caused to stand in the heavenly places as a co-heir with Christ in the world to come. Thank you for joining me today on the Bread of the Word podcast. I pray that the words we've shared have nourished your soul and helped you grow in your faith. If you found this episode helpful, consider sharing it with a friend and subscribe for more conversations on the Word of God and the journey of faith. Until next time, I am Tyler, your Lo-Fi Theologian.